Okay, hello everybody. Welcome. My name is Tim McCarthy, and I'm the director of the Human Rights and Social Movements program here at the Kennedy School at the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights Policy. This is the first installment of the year of the Activist Studio, which is a program that we began last year that I began with Rose Styron, who was a fellow here at the Carr Center last spring, and we did 5 of these events last spring, and we will continue them on this year, throughout this year, alas without Rose, although Rose called you this afternoon. I wish you well. He needed a little prep for that, so Rose gave him a call. The Activist Studio is a monthly series of public conversations with leading intellectuals and artists and activists. The format for this session today and moving forward will be a conversation between the guest and I, and I'll introduce him in a second, for about 45 minutes, and we will open it up for conversation and Q&A from the audience here. Tonight we are honored to have
Thank you.
a guest who is choreographing the audience. Tonight we are honored to have with us.
She came so early.
Yes, you did. Tonight we are honored to have with us Robert Scheer, the editor-in-chief of Truthdig. Bob is a legendary journalist, as many of you know, and also a prolific writer, most recently the author of the Great Amercian Stickup, How Reagan Republicans and Clinton Democrats Enriched Wall Street While Mugging Main Street. It was just recently released in October by Nation Books. I have a copy here, but there are also copies outside, which the Harvard Coop has graciously agreed to sell. After this session today, about 8 o'clock, we'll wrap up, and Bob will go outside and sign copies of his book for those of you who are interested in buying it. Over his 30 years as a journalist, Bob Scheer has built a reputation for strong social and political writing. His columns appear in newspapers across the country, and his in-depth interviews with many prominent political and cultural figures have made major headlines, including his famous Playboy interview with Jimmy Carter, where he confessed to having, quote, lust in his heart. Between 1964 and 1969, Bob was Vietnam correspondent, managing editor, and editor-in-chief of Ramparts magazine. From 1976 to 1993, he served as national correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. In 1993, he launched a nationally syndicated column based at the Los Angeles Times, where he was named a contributing editor. That column ran weekly for the next 12 years and is now based at Truthdig. Bob can be heard on the political radio program Left, Right, and Center on KCRW, the National Public Radio affiliate in Santa Monica, California. He's currently a clinical professor of communications at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications and Journalism. He's written 9 books, and I love the titles of these books as well as the books themselves. One included With Enough Shovels, Reagan, Bush, and Nuclear War, The 5 Biggest Lies Bush Told Us About Iraq, Playing President, My Close Encounters with Nixon, Carter, Bush 1, and Clinton, and How They Did Not Prepare Me for George W. Bush, and the Pornography of Power, How Defense Hawks Hijacked 9/11 and Weakened America. His latest book, as I said, is The Great Amercian Stickup, and it was just recently released. Raised in the Bronx, Bob attended public schools and graduated from City College in New York. He studied as a Maxwell Fellow at Syracuse University and was a Fellow at the Center for Chinese Studies at UC Berkeley, where he did graduate work in economics. He's a contributing editor at The Nation magazine as well as a Nation Fellow, and he's also been a Poynter Fellow at Yale and was a Fellow in Arms Control at Stanford. Bob, on behalf of the Carr Center and the Human Rights and Social Movements program at the Kennedy School, welcome to the Activist Studio. Let me begin with an obvious question for those who have not yet read your book. What is the Great Amercian Stickup?
Well, the point of the title, can you hear me all right in the back? The point of the title of the book is that this problem that we're experiencing is very real across the country. We have between 40 and 50 million Americans who have either lost their homes or houses, and their mortgages are underwater and in danger of losing. Washington Post had a survey they issued today where more than half of Americans say paying their mortgage or their rent is a real issue. It's a big issue. More than half want to see a moratorium on foreclosures. So we are going through something that is the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. The pain is considerable. It's not felt by the pundit class. It's not felt by the upper reaches of the political or academic world. But when you travel to Riverside, California, South Florida, when you go to Arizona, Nevada, other places that I've been with my book, it's the only thing people want to talk about. It's destroyed their whole image of themselves, their nest egg, their future, their retirement plans, how they're going to send their kids to school. So we have something very big that has happened. And the reason I picked that title is for all of the problems of capitalism and American capitalism at this time in history, this did not have to happen. This is not like global warming or the failure of our educational system or our inability to make good cars or any of the other very big problems that we have. This was a deliberate scam. If the mafia had done it, they'd be in jail. It's that simple. The decision, the twofold decision, which I'll spell out, it's considerably detailed in the book, to allow the too big to merge, failed banks to merge, beginning with Citigroup and the merger of Travelers and Citicorp and the reversal of Glass-Steagall with the Financial Services Modernization Act, followed a year later by the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which opened the door to all these collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, and so forth, were absolutely essential to this happening. The collection of mortgages, securitizing of debt, selling them every which way, and basically creating this enormous mess. So I'm very deliberate in my choice of the title, even though they're funny titles, with enough shovels related to Reagan's belief that civil defense would save us in a nuclear war. And it was based on interviews. But I picked the title very deliberately. The subtitle, did you give the subtitle?
Yes.
Oh, okay, so I don't have to do that. It's a bipartisan problem, and I want to spell out, it'll take a few minutes to spell out the thesis in the book. But as I say, it didn't have to happen. It's the result of intense, well-funded lobbying and bipartisan corruption, basically. So now there's a tendency in some part to blame the radical deregulation that took place on Ronald Reagan. Some people even tried to blame it on George W. Bush. I've taken issue with Paul Krugman on some of these questions in that respect. And it is quite true that the move for reversing the New Deal regulations, which really began the day after they were adopted, but the sensible regulations put into place by Franklin Delano Roosevelt was underway in earnest during the 80s, and it's associated with the Reagan Revolution. In the chapter, I trace Reagan's development. The time is kind of limited here. I won't do that with the book. I knew Reagan quite well. I interviewed him before he was governor. I interviewed him before he was president. I liked him. He was very generous with his time. And I never thought he was a stupid man. I thought he was a sincere person. And there was a real contradiction to Ronald Reagan. I don't know if anybody here has read his autobiography, The Rest of Me. But Reagan paid tribute to the New Deal in that book. He said, were it not for the New Deal, his family would have starved. His father was out of work, there was no food on the table, his father went to work for the New Deal, and he was very flattering about it. And he used to have the slogan, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. Meaning that the Democratic Party got involved with all sorts of esoteric social issues and foreign policy issues that he didn't like and so forth. The other thing happened to Reagan was that as his acting career was ending, fading, whatever the right word, he went to work for General Electric. And General Electric at that time was a rather admirable company, as things go. And he visited every plant, he met with the workers, he met with the union. After all, Reagan had been a union leader, and a serious one, as head of the Screen Actors Guild, was respectful of the need of labor to organize. And the GE that he became enamored with, the GE that had a slogan, what was good for GE was good for America, you may recall. And the GE became enamored with, it's a highly unionized enterprise. First, the United Electrical Workers, then the IUE, big industrial unions, and the same as in the auto industry. The working conditions were very good. The benefits, I mean, now they seem utopian compared to what we have. And it was a company that made good products. Their light bulbs were good and their refrigerators were good. Now, something happened to GE, as something happened to General Motors, and that GE, by the time of the banking meltdown, if Reagan were alive, I think he would have been shocked to discover it, 2/3 of GE's profit came from GE Capital, came from its banking operation. And GE no longer was focused on the business of making refrigerators and light bulbs. They were focused on the business of shuffling papers and loans around and doing very much the same thing that Goldman Sachs and Citigroup and others were doing, and 2/3 of the profit came. Same thing happened at General Motors. General Motors Acceptance Corporation got in big trouble for doing just this sort of thing. So when we think of the dominance of finance in America and the paper shuffling and the not making anything but making a lot of money, it seeps over into what was traditional corporate industrial activities as well, and GE is a good example. Anyway, Reagan adopted the slogans of get government off the back of people. He was very much influenced, I discussed it in some detail, but very much influenced by GE's propaganda machine, which became quite effective. And when he came in, of course, this was his goal. He hadn't done much of this in California, but as president, this was his mission. A young congressman, a Democratic congressman, Phil Gramm, got enamored with all this thing. He dropped out of the Democratic Party, ran as a Republican, and he was off to the races. He had a student, a graduate student, his Wendy Graham, who then became the high priestess of radical deregulation, advocate for it, various institutions, and so forth. Reagan referred to her as his favorite economist. She then became the head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission under Reagan and under Bush. And after, when Clinton was in, she had a center and was very much an advocate of, say, radical financial deregulation. Get rid of the onerous New Deal restrictions on finance. Phil Gray, meanwhile, was rising through the Senate, became head of the banking committee, was very powerful. Okay. Now, Reagan could not pull off the radical deregulation because he had the savings and loan scandal. And the savings and loan scandal aroused a great populist anger in the country. And so the irony is, I discussed in the book, and this is why I think people like Krugman are wrong, is that Reagan held his nose and actually signed off on a tightening of financial regulations rather than a weakening. He started out with a big bang. He did some things that were really quite bad in terms of Fannie and Freddie Mac becoming basically private institutions, which sets them up for a great fall after. But in terms of actual regulation, at the end of his tenure, he tightened. The first President Bush really wasn't much interested, although he had Wendy Graham and Phil Gramm pushing him, but still this was not his issue. So it remained for Bill Clinton. And what happened was Bill Clinton came in with a philosophy of triangulation, win-win, let's split the difference, and so forth. And it was manifested in a number of ways, one of which was the Telecommunications Act, which endeared him to the people who owned major news organizations, which included, by the way, GE and NBC in those days. And as a result of the Telecommunications Act and the pursuit of synergy, and again, modernize, deal with the modern world, the newspaper that I worked for, and I did cover this issue at the time in the hearings, that newspaper is now in bankruptcy, as is the Tribune Company. Maybe they're climbing out now, and not because the LA Times doesn't make money. It doesn't make as much as it used to make, but it's still profitable. But it got involved in all of these financial mergers and so forth. But anyway, you had the Telecommunications Act, which was part of the general mood of the 90s. Let's modernize, let's be competitive internationally, and the media bought into it, as I will indicate. And then you had what I think was a horrid piece of legislation, the welfare reform. When I interviewed Clinton when he was still governor of Arkansas, when he was running, I looked into his claim for success in the poverty program. They were fraudulent, but still that's Arkansas, so we thought, well, maybe he can't do very much. But he agreed on 2 points. He was very clear. The poverty program had to be kept federal, and it had to spend more money if you're going to have real reform. You have to help 70% of the people on welfare were children. You have to provide child care, job training, so forth. He abandoned that in the great spirit of win-win and triangulation. So we had welfare reform. As a result, now, when we have 44 million people living under the official poverty line of $21,400, what it is for a family of 4, we don't even know where these people are. We don't have national records, and they're left to the tender mercy of the states. And so we only know by broad census figures or looking at food banks. But the main thing, the subject in my book, concerns these 2 pieces of legislation. And one that specifically reversed Glass-Steagall, the banks have been pushing for forever, and that was the Financial Services Modernization Act, otherwise known as the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, and then a year later, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. Now, just to indicate, I can read this, right?
Sure.
It's a college, why not?
We read here.
No, it's a book. No, I mean, because, you can babble on, and, I did spend a few years researching it, but not only that, I got interested in this subject because I was covering this at the time. And I found the whole thing appalling. At that point, I began as a national correspondent for the LA Times, and I had quite a bit of leeway, so I convinced my editors to let me do this. There wasn't much interest. Most of the people at the hearings were lobbyists or trade publications. Ironically, one of the few individuals I want to single them out who really opposed to the reverse of Glass-Steagall was William Safire. His newspaper wasn't opposed to it. They were cheerleading. But Safire objected, and as did a number of principled conservatives, not to be confused with the dominant variety now, on the grounds that it threatened privacy and that it was too big to fail. And there were 8 senators who voted against it, only 8. One of them was in trouble. Russ Feingold now, ironically, being blamed for a meltdown that he predicted would happen if you did this. But at the time, when I went to these hearings, there really wasn't much interest. There was a lot of money poured in, $300 million, lobbying like crazy. And you go up to some friendly congressmen, I remember even going up to Barney Frank at that time, and others, people I knew and had covered, and I said, look, I've been reading this bill, and it doesn't look very good to me. And I said, what does this mean? And you get this sort of answer. This stuff is very complex, Bob. And this whole market thing and emerging internationally and how it relates, and there's mathematics involved and everything, and so forth. And so, fortunately, I had been in graduate school in economics, and so I knew a little bit about it. I wasn't intimidated, and so I said, but I still don't think that this is really going to be a thing. And then he said, well, why don't you talk to my assistant, Charlie, over there? And Charlie's really on top of this. And Charlie would tell me he's working on a number of things and really couldn't quite figure it all out, but I should talk to Harry. And Harry would be the lobbyist. And the lobbyists were in on the writing of the bills and everything. And the lobbyists, you have to understand, no longer are big, white, fat guys bellying up to the bar. They come in every size and shape and color. You want a transgendered Chinese lobbyist, you'll get one. You want an old, white, male lobbyist, you'll get one. And they're tailored to you, and there's a lot of money spent. And our schools turn them out in droves. The lawyers who do this, PR people, and so forth, spin doctors and what have you. So, anyway, the thing that triggered the reversal of Glass-Steagall was that Citibank and Travelers had gotten permission from the Fed, from Alan Greenspan, to merge. Now, a deal basically had been made. It's a funny story, but after I did all my research, I happened to be going through the Oakland airport, and Robert Reich was being wanded, and he was stretched out like this. And I thought, first of all, this is what's wrong with our security system. I'm sailing through, and he's being wanded. But I took advantage of this to ask him to talk to him about my theory about what had happened, because after all, he had been in the cabinet, and I had also talked to Cantor and others, and I actually talked to Clinton about it several times. So while he was there, and then we went off and talked a little bit, and he confirmed, and you'll notice, by the way, in the back of my book, I have a blurb from Henry Waxman, who was one of the sharper observers in the House, and mentioning Clinton's responsibility in this as well, which I thought showed some courage on his part. But Reich affirmed this, that basically Clinton turned to Robert Rubin and some other prominent Democrats, Rubin had been honcho at Goldman Sachs, and Greenspan came in, and your local hero Summers, up to his eyeballs in this. And the whole idea is, why doesn't Wall Street like the Democrats? They eat at the same restaurants that we do, they send their kids to the same prep schools, they're liberal on the social issues, and yet they give the money to Republicans, why don't they give money to Democrats? And the argument came back, you don't understand how onerous these regulations are. You have to modernize, you have to free us up. And so basically, the deal with the devil was made. What triggered the actual deal, because there was still resistance to reversing Glass-Steagall and giving this license to read, was that Citibank and Travelers made a merger, and Greenspan at the Fed gave it a temporary exemption for the other way. And this was a clear violation of Glass-Steagall, because Travelers by that time was no longer just an insurance company. Now Travelers is split off. It is an insurance company. Travelers had investment activity and so forth, and and Citibank had federally insured deposits. And remember, the principle was a very clear one. Investment banks, coming from Roosevelt administration, investment banks are playing with or using rich people's money. They are presumably sophisticated investors. They know what they're doing, and if they get hurt, they get hurt. It's a victimless crime in a sense. But we have to preserve the mainstream banking, the federally insured deposits, basic mortgages, the basic lending, and so forth. That has to be regulated. The two should not merge. And Grassley looked at that wall. Now, the merger of Citibank and Travelers was going to break that, and they had this temporary exemption. But if they didn't get the law changed, they would have to divest, and the deal would make no sense. Okay? So, I just want to read, just to show you how popular was the consensus at the time, from the New York Times editorial of April 8th, 1998. And at that time, okay, so they're talking about the need to change the law. And there had been this press conference, and Citigroup and Citicorp and Travelers had announced their merger. Stanford Weil and John Reed. John Reed, by the way, now thinks it was all a very bad idea. Stanford Weil had not said that. So I'm going to quote from the New York Times. This is Reed and Weil, they have announced, and think of the language here, because now we know too big to fail what a monstrosity that has been. And Citigroup, you know, we had to bail out $45 billion directly. We had to underwrite $300 billion in toxic assets. They were major bundlers of these all-day and subprime mortgages, and their stock is trading at $4 a share. It's a big disaster case. And we own, by the way, a chunk of it still, just like we own 92% of AIG, in other words. Okay, they have announced a $70 billion merger, the biggest in history. That would create the largest financial services company in the world, worth more than $140 billion. If regulators approve the merger, Citigroup, as the company will be called, will serve about 100 million customers in 100 countries. In one stroke, okay, parse the language here, in one stroke, they will have temporarily demolished the increasingly unnecessary walls built during the Depression to separate commercial banks from investment banks and insurance companies. Okay? So this is an editorial. But it wasn't just the editorial. The news report that day in the New York Times, the same language coming straight from the lobbyist. Quote, in a single day, this is a news report, in a single day, with a single bold merger, pending legislation in Congress to sweep away Depression-era restrictions on the financial services industry has been given a sudden and unexpected new chance of passage. Just a week ago, the measure, the 11th attempt in 2 decades to update, not gut, update, the nation's banking laws was written off as dead. But the announcement on Monday of a giant merger of Citicorp and Travelers Group not only altered the financial landscape of banking, it also changed the political landscape in Washington. And it goes on to say, indeed, within 24 hours of the deal's announcement, lobbyists for insurers, banks, and Wall Street firms were huddling with Congressional Banking Committee staff members to fine-tune a measure that would update the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act. Okay? And that's what happened. And then Clinton signed off on it, and Clinton said, over the past 7 years, we have tried to modernize the economy, and today what we are doing is modernizing the financial service industry, tearing down those antiquated laws, and granting banks significant new authority. That's Bill Clinton, who to this day has not apologized for this. He has, but did for about 3 hours, apologize for the next piece of legislation, the Commodity Futures Trading Modernization Act. So let me just switch to that now. So you've got the too big to fail. We're going to have to bail them out no matter what they do, and so forth. And what happens next is you've got these new gimmicks coming. They started with this, but they're now spiraling out of control. Collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, and so forth. Spiraling out of control. And what do we do? You have a brilliant woman, you probably know all about her now, but when I first discovered her, she was unknown, named Brooksley Born. Okay, Brooksley Born should get the Nobel Prize for economics. She was one. Brooksley Born, a very interesting person. She was the first woman editor of the Stanford Law Review. She went on to become a leading lawyer for banks and corporations and so forth, working in Washington. She was a friend of Hillary Clinton because of the Bar Association. They had worked together on women's issues. She almost got Janet Reno's job. did. So they gave her the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, a small, underfunded agency. And she went gangbusters with it. She knew this stuff. She knew it cold. She looked at it and she said, my God, this thing is spiraling out of control. This is way before Warren Buffett talked about financial instruments of mass destruction. 202. So Brooksley Born saw it. She testified over a dozen times before congressional committees about this disaster. She then had the temerity to issue a concept release. She couldn't make law. Concept release saying, this stuff is getting out of control. It's trillions of dollars all over. We don't know what's in these packages. We don't know what they do. We don't know who's accountable. And this is really very serious. We have to study it. She was a member of the President's Committee, along with Summers and Rubin and Greenspan. So what happened was, by now, Rubin had left. Where did Rubin go, by the way? When I was a journalist working for the LA Times, if I went to my friend Alice Waters' restaurant, Chez Panisse in Berkeley, and she offered me a dessert, Bob, try our new pie, or have a glass of wine, I had to fight with her for the bill. I had to say, no, I will have an apparent conflict of interest, even though I'm not going to write about your restaurant. Right? Right. So that's a standard, conflict of interest. You know? What Robert Rubin, who pushed through the law making Citigroup legal, then gets a job working for Citigroup. $15 million a year. A year, $15 million. On Wall Street, that's not considered outlandish. He was actually interviewed in the New York Times and other papers at the time saying he only did this because it was interesting educational. During that time, that's when Citigroup went crazy with all the subprime, was one of the major offenders in this whole area. And he was there through 2009. Okay? So just put that on the desk. Now Summers has taken over. Summers is a man who is constantly rewarded for his failures. It's just astounding kind of what passes for meritocracy. Now, Summers was, if anything, more enthusiastic than Rubin for all of this radical deregulation. Now, in order to shut up Brooksley Born and to prevent any move to regulate these over-the-counter derivatives, mind you, we're talking about packages with credit card debt, housing debt, and so forth. Challenging, by the way business had been done throughout all of English common law, our law, and so forth, where somebody gave you a mortgage for 30 years. The bank wanted to make sure you were viable, and they wanted to make sure the value was in the house because they were going to be holding it for 30 years. You went belly up, they were stuck with it, so there was a certain logic to this. Adults were watching the store. When you got permission to be able to take these mortgages and put them into bundles, sell them and resell them, get phony insurances to back them up, the kind that AIG sold without money behind it, unhinge them from local county governments. That's why we have the problem now with mirrors. That's why they're losing their case in court, because 65 million mortgages in America are owned by a computer bank in Western Virginia that is owned by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, West Countrywide, and so forth, and so on. So you unhinge it, this house, this precious thing, family values, your nest egg, the sacred thing, the only thing we really give an interest deduction for. You unhinge that even from the county courthouse. You don't even know who owns it. So you slice and dice and sell it. That's the story you're probably familiar with. Okay, so we have this incredibly reckless thing. Brooksley Born, really, you know more about it than what sounds the alarm. They not only push her out and silence her, they pass legislation. Legislation. Because they're so worried about her concept release, they want to give legal certainty, favorite words that someone's used all the time, to the markets, so the markets would not be spooked. Not spooking the markets is the main theme of all of this. It goes through the bailout, it goes through why we can't ask anything from the markets now. So I just want to read a little bit of what Summers was saying back then, and then I'll stop.
Questions, yeah.
No, I mean, I got a lot more to say. Just want to give you a shot here. Goodness, I lost one. Well, go ahead, ask me your question.
All right, I want to talk to you about the politics of this. Your book has, the regulatory system was put in place by a Democratic administration in a time of economic crisis, right? You begin the story of the acceleration of deregulation with a Republican president, who you just said you respected and you felt was someone of great sincerity, although someone who certainly can be blamed for beginning that acceleration. But you equally blame, if not actually more intensely blame, the Democrats, particularly your supervillain, Bob Rubin, your slightly less supervillain, Larry Summers, Alan Greenspan, and others. But the crux of the deregulation that you're talking about happened under Democratic watch with Democratic president. What I'm interested in now is we know that the ramifications of the meltdown are going to have a deleterious effect on Democratic control, certainly of Congress, and may have a damaging control on Democratic president. Is that fair, that the Republican Party seems to have gotten out of the blame game with respect to being pinned for at least part of this financial crisis that is the result of a bipartisan attempt to deregulate the financial industry over the course of the 80s and 90s and aughts?
No, it's not fair. The faux populism of Sarah Palin, attempt to avoid responsibility. There are some sincere libertarians. I would put Rand Paul and Ron Paul in that category. I would put the fellow, I can't remember his name, who went up in Alaska, who was against the bailout and has pointed the finger at Wall Street. There are a few sincere free market conservatives left who believe that if a bank fails, it should be allowed to go belly up, just like you will have to lose your house. But in the main, the issue is being demagogued by the Tea Party movement, which is not taking responsibility and not owning their own policies. And yes, the Republicans were the most enthusiastic for this, my point about Clinton. And my interest here, it's very interesting how we get marginalized in society. Guys like Rubin and Summers are considered, the New York Times always refers to Summers as brilliant.
Everyone
I have yet to find an adequate sentence from this guy. Right. But somehow I am demonizing Robert Rubin. No, Robert Rubin demonized himself. Right. Trust me, I did not manufacture this guy.
We're familiar with Rob Rubin and Summers.
No, but I mean, it's interesting, So, yes, specifically to answer your question, it is unfair indeed, certainly to blame a Russ Feingold, or a Dennis Kucinich who's in trouble, or a number of other people, Henry Waxman or somebody. There were principled, liberal Democrats who...
But you talk in your book that the same people who drove the car off the cliff are still at the wheel.
Yes. So
right? So Obama put those people back.
I found my Summers paragraphs.
Okay.
I'm going to read it.
All right.
Thank you for the help here. But the reason I want to do this is because, again, you give these little talks and everything, and, okay, I got a nice review. My book is in its third printing. I'm not complaining. Thanks to Amy Goodman, I have an audience. Thanks to Truthdig, our website has been visited 50 million different times, unique visits. So we have a following. The LA Times gave me a great review, and that's a paper that I got forced out by the Tribune Company, and USA Today. So I'm not here to whine.
Right.
But the fact is, the establishment, the meritocracy and so forth, is very deeply at fault here, and they can walk away from it. So I don't want to let them walk away from it. And so I just want to read what Summers said back then in real time. And it goes to your question of why he should not have been trusted to save us.
By the way, he sends his regrets for not being able to be hired.
It does, but let me say, so the whole argument on these derivatives, of course, these are these experts, they know what they're doing. So this is what Summers said in his testimony. This was very typical of his position. He said, this is testimony, why you had to have this Commodity Futures Modernization Act. Mr. Chairman, the American over-the-counter derivatives market is second to none. In a few short years, it has assumed a major role in our own economy and become a magnet for derivative business from around the world. The dramatic development of this market has occurred on the basis of complex and fragile legal and legislative understandings which the Commodity Futures Trading Commission released, that's the Brooksley Born, put into question. And then he explains why they don't need regulation. He says, first, the parties to these kinds of contracts are largely sophisticated financial institutions that would appear to be eminently capable of protecting themselves from fraud and counterparty insolvencies, and most of which are already subject to basic safety and soundness regulations under existing banking and security laws. Okay? Think of the disaster that has unfolded. And by the way, those existing laws he swept aside with his legislation. Second, given the nature of the underlying assets involved normally, namely supplies of financial exchange and other financial instruments, there would seem to be little scope for market manipulation. If I had written a sentence like that, I would not be writing columns today. I think I have sufficient humility. I would be off in a retreat examining how I work. Okay? When you think of what has actually unfolded, there would seem to be little scope for market manipulation of the kind seen in traditional agricultural commodities. We should have the stability we have in traditional commodities. We have exactly the opposite. And to make your point about the Republicans, the thing about the expertise, remember the Committee to Save the World, the cover of Time magazine, so much from so, and at one point when the banking meltdown was occurring, and this I got from Paulson's book, George Bush was sitting there in the White House with Henry Paulson. Now, Henry Paulson, like Robert Rubin, was at Goldman Sachs. Henry Paulson was the chair. Goldman Sachs was doing a lot of these collateralized debt obligation. And George Bush, who had the charm of being willing to admit his ignorance, asked him, how did this happen? Here's the President of the United States. Our economic world is collapsing. How did this happen? And Paulson writes in his memoir, it was a humbling question for someone from the financial sector to be asked. After all, we were the ones responsible. Okay? That's an honest statement. But when you read Paulson's memoir, he goes on to say that when he was talking to Bush at that time, he still did not know that housing mortgages were at the heart of these collateralized debt obligations that were causing all the trouble. He did not know what made the toxic assets toxic. You have to keep that in mind when we accept this idea. They know what they're doing. They are smart, and so forth. And in fact, one CEO after another has gotten up before Congress and said, I really didn't understand. I didn't know what the AIG unit was really doing in London. Now, they were warned in real time, which goes to the Clinton question. Long-term capital management went belly up when Clinton was still president. Went belly up before the Commodity Futures Modernization Act passed. And went belly up precisely because of this kind of financial shenanigans. They had the warning, and they didn't heed. And what happens, very interesting, my last summer's shot here, one of the terrible things about the legislation that he pushed through, and he really did push it through, was that it contained something called the Enron loophole. Okay? And this very interesting exchange, I don't know if you follow the Enron case, but if you lived in California, you knew it was a disaster of what happened to gaming in the market. Of course, the company went belly up, and a lot of people got hurt. But people don't seem to understand that the connection between that and the radical deregulation. Enron could not have existed were it not for changes in the political economy. Enron was just a normal, traditional trading company. They needed the laws changed. And it's true, they had a great deal of influence with Bush, but they had it also with Clinton. And so there's an interesting exchange in the University of California, Berkeley is sort of the lead plaintiff against Enron, and so there's a great amount of material, emails, and everything. But one of the things that I found just before in the hotel, I was looking over my Summers references. Thought I'm going to be here. So when Summers was Treasury Secretary, there's something in the Enron, there's a lot in the Enron of how did they get the Enron loophole, making it possible. And by the way, Wendy Graham, who was pushing all this, what did happen to Wendy Graham after? Wendy Graham went on the Enron board. She was on their audit committee when they went belly up, okay? What happened to Phil Graham? UBS. When he left the Senate, he went to work for UBS, up to his eyeballs in this. So we're talking about major league hustlers. I mean, people who get legislation passed and really are rewarded moments. So here was Summers. And Summers, okay, so there was a problem with the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, and Enron wants, it's a loophole put in. And so these are the emails that came from their lobbyists, one of whom, by the way, now working for the Fed, Linda Robertson. She was Summers' assistant in the Treasury Department and became the head of the Enron Washington office. And this comes from the Congressional Research Service. And it explains what happened. And then, but the main thing is, there's a letter, we're not getting what we need. And Ken Lay is out of the country. And then someone said, we've called Treasury. Treasury was Summers. Treasury has sent over new wording. And it's in the bill. And Ken is going to rejoice. It's in the emails. This is how it works. And in terms of Summer's reward, I don't think Harvard was big time money. Was it 600,000 a year or something? 570,000? But everybody seems to forget when Summers went to work with Obama as an advisor, he got $8 million while he was advising Obama. He got $4 million from the D.E. Shaw hedge fund. Okay. And he got $4 million from Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and these other big Wall Street firms. Goldman Sachs gave him $135,000 for 1 half-hour talk. We don't call that bribery. $8 million, you're advising a candidate to the president, and you're getting that kind of money, and it's not even an issue. Nor did we make it an issue, and I'm somebody who very enthusiastically supported Obama. I gave $500 36 hours before the polls closed, and I was worried about him. My wife had already maxed out, you know. And we all looked the other way when the guy said he wasn't going to take public financing. And lo and behold, Wall Street ended up being a major source of his contributions.
Let me follow up on that, because I also maxed out and turned the other way, and I plead guilty in that as well. And yet, the story you paint, the picture you paint here, the story you tell is a bleak one. And it's one that is a quite stunning kind of account of this bipartisan treachery. And it doesn't end with any kind of upswing. It doesn't end with any kind of beacon of hope. And so if the folks who drove the car off the cliff are still at the wheel, and Obama has sort of sold out his administration to these people as well, is there any hope that there is going to be in the political party system in the United States any kind of aggressive attempt to check the excesses of capitalism, either in the United States or in its global manifestations? Or are we just at a point where Ralph Nader was telling us a decade and a half ago when he was playing the spoiler, the parties are essentially the same thing. There's no difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Your book would suggest that that is true.
Yeah, it's a.
Is there any scenario?
So let me just say, I owe Ralph Nader an apology, a big apology.
Yeah.
Because on the Nation cruise, and the great thing about the internet, you can go find it if you want. I had a debate with Ralph Nader.
The Nation cruise is a great location of resistance.
You can't get off. You can't get off the boat. And there I was, one-on-one with Ralph Nader, pounding the old man into the ground, you know. And, you know, come on, there is a lesser evil, and this is progress, and we're breaking a glass ceiling here, and blah, 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 blah. And I'm embarrassed by it. I'm embarrassed by it. I bought in. Look, this is not my area of expertise.
Yes.
It isn't. I've been wrong about my political judgments, probably as wrong as I've been right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in terms of who to back and blah, blah, blah. But we have to understand the power of the financial sector. 2/3 of all the profit made in this country went to that sector during the 5 years of madness. That means everything else everyone else was doing counts for 1/3. We're talking about billions being something you can toss around. We're talking about an incredibly, I hope we can just discuss briefly what happened to our academic world and the meritocracy. I mean, what has happened here in our country is we replaced the landed gentry that used to control places like this, you know, and the blue bloods and the inherited wealth and the legacies, and then we replaced them with the notion of meritocracy that was supposed to have the appeal of connecting us with real lives of real people. But it doesn't work like that at all. We had to replace it because the landed gentry became too stupid and inbred and everything. They can carry their weight in a complex world. But what happened was they simply select out, and Barack Obama is a very good example, select people out from all races and all colors and all regions, and instead of allowing them then, as was the principle of the land-grant college and so forth, more effectively serve their community and relate to their community. No, we take them to the elite colleges, and you know, for Obama, it wasn't enough to go to Occidental. No, he had to transfer out to Columbia, and it's got to be Harvard, you know, and blah, blah, you're off to the races. And look at what has happened here. I mean, when Halberstam wrote about the Vietnam War and talked about the best and the brightest, this is the best and the brightest here. This is what happened here. The guys who drove long-term capital management, in fact, 2 of them won Nobel Prizes. You know, we're on the board. So you're talking about very smart people doing very bad things. And we have to really ask the question, where are the ethics courses? You know, do they have any sense of social connection? Look at the misery that these people created. You know, you're suggesting I want to demonize it. No, I can't even capture
I'm not
how much
suggesting that.
grief.
Yeah.
You talk about family values. I have kids come into my office that have to leave school. They're ashamed. They blame their parents. We always blame ourselves in this culture. My father signed a student. He should have read the fine print. I can't even understand the fine print. We assume that when a bank gives you a mortgage, somebody who can read this stuff is checking it out, right? We assume there's some accountability, you know, to understand teaser rates and adjustable and changing when nobody wanted to make sense of it because they want to package it and sell it. You know, as I say, this was a scam, and we should have been protected from that. You know, and the pain out there, by the way, moral hazard is amazing. Going to your question of what was done by Obama, we gave the big banks no moral hazard, right? We bailed them out for their errors. We bailed them out. But if you want to have a moratorium on foreclosures, they say, oh, no, moral hazard. Those people took those loans. Well, first of all, the people hurting are not just people who got lousy loans. If you're living on a block in Riverside or somewhere, or even in a condo somewhere, and 3 or 4 people on your block have gone belly up and someone's stealing the plumbing and the electricity, or in your condo association, they're not paying their homeowners fees, you're all hurting. And the value of all houses have gone down. And that's why we don't have consumption, and that's why we can't solve the unemployment problem. And we may be in best case, probably for 10 years of stagnation. And you know, every morning we wake up, oh, is it getting better? You know, but we don't really see positive signs. And so here you have that Washington Post poll telling you that more than half of Americans are freaked out about paying their rent or mortgage. Okay, and then they also want a moratorium on foreclosures. And this president, who's supposed to be of the people and hope and community organized, turns his back on it. Denounces it. Denounces it. Even the banks voluntarily and temporarily saw they needed some kind of moratorium while you figure out who owns this stuff, okay? Sort it out. And clearly keeping people in their homes by readjusting the rates, temporary, whatever you do makes sense. It would be in the long-term interest of the banks to do that. They can't act in their long-term interest. So a question I would put, because I would really be upset if I took the red eye here and spoke in this place and didn't raise it. I want to know what happened to the elite education in America. I want to know, what did Robert Rubin learn here at the law school? You know, what is Lawrence Summers all about? Not to demonize, but to understand, what are we doing? And I would say it about the school where I teach. I've had meetings over at the law school and the business school, at UCLA, USC, and oh no, we didn't teach economics. Or yeah, we got economics and ethics. I mean, we got ethics in this way. But we didn't really center the whole idea that there's some social responsibility, that you're accountable for your actions, you know. What happened to that? At least, you know, I profiled Nelson Rockefeller. I knew something about the old elite. At least those guys thought it would matter what the 6 generations down the road thought. That's why they built all those libraries and things. They actually cared enough about the survival of the society. This new gang, they care about the quarterly reports. You know, what is Robert Rubin giving any money back? He's fly fishing in Montana. He's still lionized. You know, I mean, it's astounding. And so to answer the question, by the way, who we should back, and you know, yes, I would like to see Obama succeed. Yes, I think it's important for the well-being of the country that he not be a failure. Yes.
Well, let me follow up on that, because
But I'm not optimistic, if you like. I think money is so corrupting. I think in this society, careerism trumps everything. Everything. You know, we've lost any of our religious moorings. We've lost any sense of decency. It's shocking to me. It's just absolutely shocking. And when you write a book like this and you go back through all of the conniving and the cheating, I mean, including people I admire. Jesse Jackson, for God's sake. Somebody I've known forever. I used to defend Jesse Jackson. He comes in because Sandy Wiles brings him in to lobby for the reversal of Glass-Steagall. Jesse Jackson. And who's hurt more than anybody else in this country? Poor black people who got swindled into putting every cent they had into some lousy mortgage, you know? And you know, has anybody even asked you, well, what was great about Sandy Wiles? Oh, you know, he gave money to the Harlem Dance Group. Or he backed Jesse's thing about getting more black people on Wall Street. I mean, the buyouts are incredible here. Well, how do we decide what to study in these universities? We get funding. Who gives you the funding? The people who got this big money. So don't look at this stuff, look at that stuff. You know, when I was teaching at USC, I came from UCLA, and I said, hey, let's do welfare watch. Let's figure out what happens to poor people now that we've got welfare check. We couldn't get any money to fund that. But we got lots of money to fund everything else in the world, you know. So, you know, and since I see Richard here, I'm going to throw out one last idea, because he's an economist, and we go back some ways. And it seems to me where this really started now about the economic profession was in the battle in the late 50s and early 60s between what were called institutional economists and the econometrics. I stumbled into this debate because I had studied engineering as an undergraduate. And I really didn't know anything about what they called the study of it. I thought I was about the economy. And I ended up having a teaching assistantship in Berkeley in economics. Henry Wasowski, who came to Harvard, was our chair. But before Henry, Andreas Papandreou had been our chair. He went on to be Prime Minister of Greece. And we had a great department. And I was on the wrong side of this divide because I had this math skills, okay, and I was TAing economics. I was standing with somebody, but no one cared. We're going to develop these economic models. And at that time, economics, because they were so interested in being a pure science, got separated from political economy, sociology, philosophy, everything else. Just got torn apart. People like Tibor Skatovsky at Stanford, that was out, you know, and it was this new mathematical model. And I think it took off, as far as I can see, not just because it had the allure of pure science, but because it was funded. And these guys went to work for the banks. They went to work for Wall Street. And they got big money, and they attracted more students. And it really has become a center of corruption. And they gave out Nobel Prizes for this stuff, you know, as if it was wonderful. And it created a great deal of suffering and mischief in the society. And so it seems to me an academic institution, we ought to examine, you know, why do we study these things and not these things? And what is the direction? And what has happened to ethical standards? What about conflict of interest? Why hasn't anyone raised, I mean, I know you have people raise questions on Summers. You'll accuse me of picking on him.
Oh, no.
You know, but the fact of the matter is, how did this guy get rewarded with being president of this incredible institution, the most important in the country, right?
Because they put Bob Rubin on the Harvard Corporation. That's
Okay.
a very simple answer.
But for their failure.
Right.
Because when he got the job, he already knew that they had failed. And then, you know, how does he end up as Obama's top advisor? And Timothy Geithner, we haven't even discussed, for God's sake, that, you know, Sandy Weil referred to him as this, you know, he's so cute and youngish, boyish guy because he can manipulate him. You know, Timothy Geithner was the guy who was, Rubin got him the job as head of the New York Fed. It was in his office that he concocted the AIG deal, right? We own 92% of AIG. We're supposed to be happy because they're going to pay us back. How did they pay us back? They took the preferred stock and made it common stock. At least we had a shot when it was preferred. You know, AIG is not coming back in the way that's going to make us good. He puts that deal together in the dark of night on a Sunday, starts in the late afternoon. Weinstein and these other people are consulted. We still don't have the minutes of those meetings. You know, that's Timothy Geithner in that job, head of the New York Fed, swinging with Bush, if you want to talk about bipartisan, totally with Paulson, Bush, on throwing money at the bank, and he's brought in his Treasury Secretary. Now, to go to your darker view of politics, or not yours, but someone like Ralph Nader is absolutely right. Okay? Absolutely right. The game is so tightly rigged that, you know, maybe we don't stand a chance. I'll throw in the maybe to answer your earlier question. And that is because there's anger out there and there's rage. And you know, if it goes the way it's going, I don't want to be an alarmist, but we've seen this in other developed countries. You know, economic failure can drive madness. And you start to look for scapegoats and we'll end up, you know, who did this? You know, and we've had the experience of countries where the right-wing narrative does not have a happy conclusion. The problem is there isn't a progressive narrative. And there isn't a progressive narrative because right now, going to the subtext of your question, we are beholden to the leaders of the Democratic Party, and we don't want them to lose, because if they lose, we won't get a pro-choice person or something on the Supreme Court. Okay? And so I would leave you with a message. The right wing in America, when Goldwater lost, he lost 2-1, dramatic defeat, right, from Lyndon Johnson. They didn't fold up their tents. They said, no, we will stick to our core principle and the Republican Party will come around. When George McGovern lost by a similar proportion, the liberals in the Democratic Party were totally discredited. Hate. You know, when McGovern writes his book about a liberal, he's a brave person because he's actually willing to use the L word. Okay? And so Democrats have no sense. Progressives have no sense of what are our core principles. What are our core principles? What will we not break on?
Thanks very much. This stuff is all pretty cloudy to me, so thanks for clarifying one side of it. I'm wondering what you would imagine your the most articulate defender of some of this deregulation saying in response to what you've said tonight.
Well, the argument was, one, we have to be competitive in the world. And if we don't do it, European banks will do it, and so forth. I'm not going to give you a counter-argument. There are clear counter-arguments. We were hardly these weak little players in the market. Look at the Greek economy. Look at the Spanish economy. Goldman knew how to deal in those markets. But that's one argument. It will be done. Another argument is it's going to create money for housing, put more people into housing. They made a liberal argument. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would make the argument. Nice slogans, you know, 1 million new homeowners, more. They use liberal rhetoric. But when you cut through it, which that's what I've been doing, you cut through it, you really look at the record, you realize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were not nuclear organizations. It's true they were run by people who had liberal political values. Johnson, Franklin Delano Johnson was described as the most powerful man in Washington. He was Guantanamo's chief of staff, takes over Fannie Mae. Franklin Delano named after FDR. Takes over. He's the one that's caught in this accounting problem they had in 2004. But when you look at it, these guys were doing just what they got at Goldman Sachs. They were ostensibly government-sponsored agencies, so at the end of the day, we're now on the line. The estimate is going to be almost $400 billion to handle them. But their rewards were the very same as the others. In fact, more so. They were dependent upon the stock price, the quarterly report. They were traded on Wall Street, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And so, yes, they combined, and this is where the right wing attacks them. I had an amazing American experience today. I love this country, by the way. There's possibilities, like I'm getting a much better hearing on right wing radio than I am from established liberal radio, because at least I had the guts to say, you know, how Reagan Republicans and Clinton Democrats. So at least there's, Scheer, at least it's William Clinton. So I was on Fred Thompson, right, the former senator. I was on a show today. I called my wife. I said, "You're not going to believe it. He's my new best friend." You know, and you know, I didn't want to taunt him with his own votes, but I was amazed when he said, "Yes, there's blame on both sides." Yes, and this is what Waxman says here in my blurb. You know, blame both Clinton and Reagan. So, but the problem with the right-wing narrative when they don't blame both sides is they say, "Oh, this is all the attempt to put poor black people. This is all bleeding heart liberals. It's all Barney Frank." That's garbage. Were it true, wish it were true that Barney Frank really cared about poor people in housing, okay? Were it true that he really did this for that reason, I would respect it. That's not what happened here. What's happened here, and they didn't have to be poor, they could be a drunk taken off the street. Anyone who could hold a pen, if you couldn't get an automatic sign. Anyone to sign that piece of paper, because you had no intention of those people staying in those houses. You had no intention of doing anything for them. You were putting it into a package, and you sell the package, and you're all getting your commissions every which way, and you're getting your bonuses, and you're getting your rewards. But to answer your question, the defense would be that they did it to increase money available for housing and put more people in housing. That would be their defense. I don't think they'd make that defense now, because it's turned out to be just the opposite. But can I just answer? One other thing about that. They don't have to justify themselves. Bill Clinton, last April, was on ABC in the morning. I thought, wow, you know, this is great. I got pictures of Bill Clinton in my office, shaking hands with me. I like the guy, you know, charming. I'm always fooled by this guy. Charming. His wife said I was her favorite columnist, blah, blah. You know, the White House dinner. I was invited to a White House dinner because I didn't think you should be impeached over a stain in the dress, you know. So I was an advanced thinker. And there was, last April, I thought, Clinton has seen the light. And he said he got bad advice on commodity futures, Modernization Act from Summers, you know, and Greenspan got bad advice. 4 hours later, his press guy was running around retracting. Yeah, that's right. Retracting. So to answer your question, they don't have to give a defense. In fact, Summers, when he was doing this regulation for Obama, he attacked the whole derivatives. Said it needs to be controlled. Unfortunately, the rules they put in really don't have any teeth. No, but Summers would not now defend his earlier position. Fortunately for Summers, no one brings up his earlier position.
All right. Elliot Presser-Freeman, two quick questions. The first, you draw a distinction at the start between something imminent to capitalism in general, and then this is a scam and this is a mafia system. But I'd like to push back on it. I think that the real scandal, the real obscenity, is that none of this was illegal. This was just the functioning of the system in general. And so it's impossible to critique this without critiquing the basic patron-client system that has made America wealthy and successful for a very long time.
Not so. There's all kinds of fraud in this stuff.
Yeah, I know.
They made the laws to suit themselves, and then they broke every law that they had to otherwise.
That's exactly my
That's the
point.
point.
The second question would be, there's a lot of anger you talk about that it hasn't been able to be captured because there is no progressive narrative. And I want to just explore the Tea Party for a moment, just because a lot of the things these folks are saying, the people, perhaps not the meta-narrative coming from the people, the demagogues who have captured it, is quite kind of, I think, receptive to a left politics. And I'm wondering, what are the ways to capture that anger? Is fighting for Democrats in this election exactly the wrong thing that we need to do? In an iterative game theoretic scenario, aren't we just rewarding them because they can always rely on the left to support them, because we don't want, anti-choice people coming into office. But what breaks this kind of this never-ending cycle of left marginalization, given there's a lot of people on the ground who are pretty angry, who just right now have been captured by a narrative that is pretty ugly, where they could be captured by one that's more progressive.
And just to add one quick thing to that, is, I don't question here about Obama's foreign policy, right? We talked about the way in which there's a bipartisan sort of support for deregulation. Obama's foreign policy being absolutely incoherent. The Nobel Peace Prize winning president who's perpetrating drone attacks. He runs against the war, and now he's got two, and he may be starting a third. Absolutely incoherent. And where does the left go?
Let me just say, by the way, I am willing to stay here for hours now.
Yeah.
However, knowing that that's not going to happen, I want to reiterate, there are many things I can talk about.
Yep.
Okay. And I'm not particularly expert on some of them. I'm trying to. Really, I haven't followed some issues as closely as I should, because one of the things I've been holed up in I actually have a day job teaching. I run a website. I do radio. And, writing these books, it's really quite annoying because people don't read them. They don't take them seriously. And yet, I feel compelled to lay out the case. So I want to stick to this subject, with all due respect, because I think it's important to understand that it was a scam.
But everything is a
No,
scam.
but wait a minute. Now, first of all, throughout the whole history of capitalism, okay, we did not have these collateralized debt obligations.
Let's go back to Das Kapital. With MCM, the fact you're making money off of money, by definition, is kind of a scam.
All right.
Not if it's productive production.
Okay.
It's
Hey,
the
listen,
money's
guys, you guys can
spent.
go have a coffee.
All right,
Let me
yeah.
just tell you
That's good.
how I see what I'm saying is, we had rules in place that were working. Okay? They were working. And what was done was illegal. It was illegal. The Citigroup merger was illegal. It was against Glass-Steagall, okay? There were rules that had to be changed, by the Commodity Futures Modernization Act that some has pushed through, that would have interfered. That's what Brooksley Born was saying. She, after all, was supposed to administer these. We have rules. She was coming up with new regulations off the existing laws. The reason they silenced her is she was threatening to be effective. So we had enlightened, if you like, bourgeois politicians. We had enlightened capitalists. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was one, right? Child of ruling power recognized we have to contain this greed or it will consume it, right? There have to be rules. And I think, I don't want to get into a whole big debate about Marx, but I think Marx recognized that capitalism could only be saved by their developing certain rules of the road. for their own survival. And what these guys, there's a whole, you invite me back, I'll have another lecture on that. But what I'm saying is, this was what happened here. One of the ones I threw out before, for instance, ending the power of county governments to register more. Just think about that. Just think about that. When you go now to find out who owns your home, and you can't assume that your county registrar will have that data. How did that happen? And they didn't even pass a law on that. We didn't even have new legislation. And it used to be, by the way, a source of income for the counties, because you had to register. You know why they had to do it? Because if you're going to put it in a package, it has to be liquid. You're selling it, someone said, you can't keep going back to that county courthouse, you know, in Arkansas and re-registering it and changing the owners.
And as a result, they're selling them 10 times over.
Exactly.
Sir, I'm gonna.
No, he's right. And
Yeah.
okay, but I'm just saying, what they did, and this was totally illegal, that's why the courts are throwing them out. That's why B of A, which has inherited so many of these countrywide mortgages, had to put a temporary moratorium. That's why they're re-examining what these robo-signers and investigators did. That was totally illegal, this MERS system. But it was accepted. The regulators looked the other way, because the regulators have already been told you're out of joint, you don't have power, and so forth, and their administrations, Republican and Democrat, told them to look the other way. So our disagreement is a simple one, really. I am arguing in this book that this is a special case. Okay? There are lots of things to critique in the working of corporate capitalism. Okay? Lots of things. And we can argue about whether the corporate capitalism is compatible with the kind of democracy that our founders had in mind, an agrarian system. Whether you can really have a free press if it's owned by huge corporations. Whether you can have significant political parties when they're financed by you. I mean, I understand all those arguments, and I'm not denying their seriousness. What I'm trying to tell you is that here, in this situation, this was very much a mafia scam. This was something lobbyists pushed through, bought off politicians, you know, have enormous amounts of money to spend, can buy intellectuals, can buy the PR, can buy the law schools, look at the recruiting, look at the jobs people want. Paul Volcker, no flaming lefty, 2 weeks ago gave a speech to the Chicago Fed. Paul Volcker was appointed by Reagan. And he pointed the finger. He said, what's going on with these mathematicians and economists and lawyers? You know, what happened to them? Who makes up mathematical models that have no meaning whatsoever? You change the variables so you can sell it better. That's a con job. What kind of lawyers go all over a system that has no accountability at all? What kind of economists endorse, like Summers endorsed this Ponzi scheme of crap that you can't even understand? You know, you can't make sense of it. You know, and everybody's up their hands up in the air. You know, so all I'm saying is this is a special case. I will concede to you that it is typical of greed. The difference is it's unfettered. And to survive, European capitalism and American capitalism learn certain lessons. You have to fetter the greed. You have to have rules of the road. Those rules were thrust aside. That's why I call it the Great Amercian Stickup. Okay, so I'm not disagreeing with you about the basic underlying sickness.
Here, go ahead. Here.
Hi, my name is Laura Esquivel. I'm a mid-career here at the Kennedy School. I'll push back on you a little bit on Barney. I mean, nobody pushed harder to get Elizabeth Warren confirmed than Barney did. But I don't want to debate Barney. I want to talk about
Let's
Elizabeth
debate.
Warren. Okay.
I'll give you two questions. You want me to debate one?
No, I don't want to debate Barney. I want to talk about Elizabeth Warren.
Okay.
You know, Obama could do so much to redeem himself, not only with liberals, but to actually do something good for people if he would appoint Elizabeth Warren. And I can't believe that Geithner, you know, the opposition to her from within the Obama White House is preventing that. I don't know if you saw, but yesterday she said that there's no need to call for a national moratorium on foreclosures, which really surprised me. I mean, she's putting in all. She said that she has more faith in the attorneys general of the states. And of course, a lot of them are going to go for re-election next week. But I was really surprised about that. I mean, I haven't. given up on the hope that the Consumer Protection Agency is actually going to do something.
Okay, we have to be civil, you know.
That's
These
ridiculous.
are legitimate.
I got better things to do. Hey, by the way, thank you for the book.
Okay. Does this happen to Tea
It's hard
Party?
to,
Yes,
it's hard to
of
not
Does
be
happen to Tea
cynical.
Party?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me-
It's hard to not be cynical.
Well, let me
And
try
I'm-
to answer.
I'm fighting it
Let
too.
me try to answer this question. The game was given up when he did not appoint, wanted to go before the Senate appointed as a warrant. Because already the committee is housed in the Fed, and has to report to the Treasury Department, have an interim person. I don't want to question her motives, I think she's playing a great role, very wise woman, you know, I have enormous respect, I'm not going to question what she said yesterday, I mean, I can question it, but, you know. And by the way, I don't want to demonize Barney Frank, I think something happens in the political process which is very unappealing, that these people are fighting, they want to win a few, and they compromise to win a few, and then you win a few, you're trying to win, I didn't win anything, you know. So I'm sure Barney Frank can justify in his own mind, hey, I got my finger in the dam, you should see how much worse it would have been if I wasn't there, and I talk to these people all the time. Let me tell you, did I read the Henry Waxman thing?
No.
I was thrilled when Henry Waxman, who I consider one of the most effective members of the House and has had real hearings on this stuff and everything, and the publisher asked him, he was asked for a blurb, and he said, I'm not going to say flattering things, but he said, Robert Scheer shows that the deregulation philosophy from Reagan to Clinton and both Bushes led to the near collapse of our financial institutions and the Great Recession from which we are still suffering. Now, for Henry Waxman to put Clinton in that sentence, it told me a lot. It told me that he is worried. He told me he's seen a lot, okay? Because he recognizes that the problem is in both parties. And you know, but you know, he's got a safe seat, he's still fighting, and so forth. My concern about Obama is that his unwillingness to, first of all, I think the deregulations are very minor, they're late in coming, and they really don't solve the problem. The Consumer Protection Agency was the one kind of victory we could have had. I think it's over. Okay? I think the big battle now is over this purpose that should be treated on, which is to keep people in their homes. It's a matter of social justice. Social justice. If a community organizer from Chicago doesn't get that, then it's gone. And we're not, this, you know, I have to reiterate, we're going to end up with two people and no one will buy books, but I want to make this really clear. This is not some theoretical argument, you know. I mean, we're talking about real suffering. We're talking about families divided. You know, you lose the home. Hey, Dad, what happened? I can't go to school here anymore, you know? What's going on? Families break up. The parents lose their prestige. They lose their social contacts. They lose their sense of security. And then they embrace some kind of, you know, something that has the aura of fascism. And you wonder why? You know, I'll tell you, just so that you were going to ask some biographical questions, so let me give you one. I think a lot, I'm not getting any younger, you know, and this stuff is not always as much fun as it may seem. You know, I took the red eye last night, I'm really thrilled that people came and everything, but sometimes you just wonder, what the hell am I doing, you know? I mean, you know, and I've got a working wife, and I don't have, you know, power. So, anyway, and I think, why do you, so I thought you were going to ask that kind of question. I'll give you the answer. The great mystery in my life is I happen to have a German Protestant father and a Russian Jewish mother. And I was born in 36. And I've gone back to Germany quite a few times. I found my uncle who was in the German army. I found my family. My own brother bombed our area of Germany because as opposed to the Japanese, the Americans were trusted to bomb their own people. And, you know, I have struggled with that question more than any other question in my life. It's overwhelmed everything else. How did the most advanced, best educated society, a place where Jews were welcome, less discrimination than in most of Europe, how did they go crazy? And the recovery from madness, when they were our guys, our allies, we needed their scientists, so they went from being the most evil to good people in a matter of months in my childhood experience, you know, imagination. I never quite understood that. And people want to blame now, oh, it's Muslims who are crazy, right? Or it's Arabs who are crazy, or terrorists, blah, blah, blah. No, the greatest violence done in modern history were done by Christian, civilized, highly educated people. So I don't take lightly the suggestion that we have echoes of that in our society. Okay? But I think they're there. And I think at the heart of it is we have very high expectations, economic expectations. We are not a people that can easily go through hard times, all right? And we will look for scapegoats. We will. We will blame others, whether it's the Chinese or it's the gays or whoever.
The immigrants.
The immigrants, we will, and it's very frightening. And so, yes, I would like this to be all over. I'd like to wake up tomorrow, oh, housing's back, everything's great. I don't see it happening. You know why? Because every time housing looks like it's going to get better, these banks are still holding enormous packages of this toxic stuff. They dump it. And the Fed will dump it. And as a result, I think we're in for something we haven't experienced in our post-depression era, which is a number of very rough years. And I do worry about the stability of our political system.
Time for a couple more questions. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I just have a question about what you think we can do about the kind of culture that created this. And I think you made some really interesting points about universities and elite institutions. And I think I have a lot of optimism about human nature. And you were talking about ethics courses, but I also think that you need rules and constraints. And I was wondering, what do you think is the role of campaign finance? And speaking as an outsider, I don't know how possible that is in this country, but it clearly seems to be a huge part of it. But you were also talking outside the immediate political sphere. So what else, if campaign finance reform could be achieved, how much could that do? And what else do you think needs to be done around it?
Right. Well, first of all, I think that you have exposed my secret here, which is I am optimistic. I don't know why. But for instance, last night I had 200 students in my class, and we discussed this Juan Windler's case, hysterical, Islamophobic reaction. So we had an intelligent, thoughtful discussion with 200 18 and 19 years. We had access to information. We could go on the net. We could read. What did he say? What was the alternative argument? What do we know? So there are reasons to be optimistic. We are basically a good people. Our religions, whether it's Islam or Judaism or Hebraic or Christian, you're not supposed to exploit the vulnerable. Everybody seems to forget this. One nation under God. What happened to all this stuff about usury? Interest, exploitation of the poor. It's forgotten. The clearest message coming from Scripture is don't take advantage, right? Don't take advantage of the vulnerable. You have a responsibility, and particularly in Christian interpretation, where our tribe is everyone, right? The soul, So, with the exception of Chris Hedges, I don't know anybody who's even talking about this stuff, But I remain optimistic that people really want to do the right thing, that they are capable of figuring things out. So let me get to the role of money. Yes, if you cannot, we don't have parties even of the coherence of Europe, okay? And we don't have proportional representation. We don't have party slates. As a result, it's really difficult to get coherent alternatives expressed. It becomes, our elections have become a parody. My wife asked me, "Are you going to be back in time to vote?" I thought she was out of her mind, but I'm going to run. I promised her she would. So I'll vote for Jerry Brown again. Do I really think Jerry Brown, as governor of California, is going to be really better than Meg Whitman? No. Because Jerry, I know him. He wasn't a great mayor of Oakland. Oakland's one of the most miserable cities in the United States. I know Jerry could turn around and attack the unions and everything else. I just know he could be very cynical. But I'll probably go for this because we're all suspects. Am I thrilled with Barbara Boxer? No, because Barbara Boxer, in my last book, had a chapter attacking Barbara Boxer because she had to have big military spending because that was the way she was going to get reelected. So we spent $1 trillion on the military to fight people who had box cutters. It's absurd. So, you know, I think the elections are a fraud. I think, so yes, I think the Supreme Court decision is an absolute disaster, you know, I'm despairing. So, I don't know, can you be optimistic and despairing at the same time? That's me. No, I am. I mean, you know, I don't want to lie to people. I wouldn't be out talking if I didn't think I could make a difference. I wouldn't. I mean, I really don't enjoy this. I mean, you meet some nice people, you learn some things, but I'm not getting any younger. I'd rather be sailing. It's my bumper sticker says. You know, there are lots of things that I'd rather do. You know, I wouldn't do it if I thought, and trust me, there's no money in this. You're not giving me the $135, even $135,000, right? You know, I mean, you know, you end up picking up most of the expenses yourself. I sell books. You know, it seems to me 1 out of every 3 books I give away because some poor chap can't afford it. You know, so I mean, you know, it's not some, you know, there's no great ego trip. No one calls you brilliant. You know, write you up in the magazine, the New York Times or something. I do it because first of all, I think if we don't do it, we're really in trouble. And this goes for everything, everybody does, you know. If we don't get involved, and we don't, and I also, you know, I hope the basic good sense of the American public comes through. You know, that they will recognize that people being scapegoated are not a problem. I mean, God, you take a place like Arizona and New Mexico, this place couldn't function for a day without undocumented labor. How insulting to suggest that's the problem. You know, I mean, my God, not Wall Street, but the person cleaning your house. And by the way, you want to say, I'll give you a sad story. I'm sorry, because I get emotional. I went to a funeral of a Guatemalan woman who helped me take care of my mother. She had Alzheimer's for about 20 years. And this woman was a Great Amercian Stickup, legal, they had children, grandchildren, so forth. They moved from Long Beach, where they were cleaning office buildings, to Riverside. So the funeral was in Riverside. I go to the funeral. These are people who clean the office buildings at 6 in the morning, they go back to Riverside. Why? Because their kids could not have gangs, go to a good school. Their kids all graduate from UC Riverside. Right? Great principle of public education. And they get these jobs, and they're hustling and working, and they buy these houses. And they put everything they had into these houses. And not a one of them did anything stupid. Not a one of them was excessive or greedy or bought more house than they needed. They all were living the American dream. Every one of them is facing bankruptcy.
No.
Every one of them. That's what's happening. Does Robert Rubin know it? Does Lawrence Summers know it? Do the people who teach know it? Do the lawyers know it? I mean, the amount of real pain out there. And the kids look at you and say, Dad, you screwed up. I had a kid in my class the other day say that. She said, I said, what did you tell your father? He screwed up. He screwed up. I said, what are you talking about? He screwed up. That's what we said, you know. And then when people blame themselves, they don't want to blame themselves, they find some scapegoat. So, you know, I said we have to be involved. We have to care, but I'm not, I guess I want to be optimistic, but I'm very worried. I really am. I really wonder how this thing, well, why don't you say something? Are you worried? You're a smart guy.
I'm concerned, but I'm not frightened. I think the Democrats will lose something like 50 or 60 seats in the House. And I would remark that that happened to Harry Truman 2 years after he took office. And it happened to Bill Clinton 2 years after he took office. And we should take heart and actually think that this is within the parameters of the kind of losses that incoming presidents generally suffer. There are very few exceptions. So this is not a disaster. I mean, I actually thought... No, wait a minute. And Obama is not a disaster either. I think there is a deeper problem, which is about what it means to assimilate multiple cultures in the United States. Because, Bob, you're right to point to a problem, which is how profoundly these elite institutions have changed over the last half century, just the same way that investment banking has changed over the last half century. And in a perverse way, the attempt to carry out the ideal of a coherent and an integrated multicultural society rather than a layered and a racially and ethnically divided one has left us with institutions like Harvard, which has a glorious set of standards for acceptance of students, which is incredibly heterogeneous compared to when I went through these institutions 40 years ago. But the output is more homogeneous as they head for investment banks and as they head for McKinsey than it ever was. I mean, my generation was ready to go to the Peace Corps. My generation was ready to go live in the country. I mean, there was a lot more homogeneity on the input and more heterogeneity in the output, and the exact opposite has happened. And so I think there is a conscious crisis of the idea of social organization that the left has to face, which is that the project of pluralism in and of itself has proved to be incomplete. And we don't actually have a coherent political economic vision, irrespective of ethnic, cultural, and racial identity, that we can hold up to the American people as a whole. And a lot of what you're seeing is the rage and anger of what was a formally dominant white majority as it slips into increasing minority status, and that will make them more dangerous, and it will make them more prone to right-wing argument. And we on the left are still focused so heavily on multiculturalism and pluralism of input that we haven't given political space for them to see themselves in our common project. And we're losing it.
Well, let me just say, I really disagree with this. I really do. Let me see if I can put this as constructively as possible.
Mhm.
I think that the people that we have supported turn out to be really bad actors. Not that they didn't do as much as they should. Not that they're the lesser evil, you can't do everything. I mean, they turned out to embrace evil. I think when you put together a scam, making it too big to fail back, and then go work for it for 15 million a year. And then, as late as January 08, when Robert Rubin stood up in Cooper Union, and we don't even know about it, but there was an enterprising reporter from the newspaper there,
Mhm.
and say, we don't even have a crisis. This is the normal working of the market. And this guy, to this day, has not accepted any, not learned anything. You have a Lawrence Summers, who has not, as far as I can see, learned anything from this. I have to really wonder, are these the people we're supposed to think are the lesser evil? I prefer the rage of a Rand Paul. Not a libertarian. I believe there should be vigorous public role. I believe in public education. But if I had to make a choice between a Rand Paul going to the Senate right now in Kentucky and a traditional, enlightened, liberal-sounding Democrat, I prefer Rand Paul. I would, because there's got to be some measure of accountability. I mean, my goodness, this is, the way you're presenting, okay, first of all, this is, you take Clinton out of reversal, that's when he went off to this wild deregulation. That's when he screwed the poor. How can we possibly think of Clinton as some success in any way at a time when we have the 44 million people living below the poverty line? When we're back to, even as a percentage of the population, back to 94 million. The mischief this guy created, what he did, the heartlessness of it. So why should I look at his ability to recover when Clinton, for the next 6 years, presided over this disaster? Income inequality, let's take income inequality, something that you've written about. Where's the middle class? What has happened here? We have these extremes now, and we know that's a prescription for disaster. That was the Clinton bubble. Most of the gain, the great Clinton years, went to the top 1%, 2%, a little bit more to the top 10%, nothing to the bottom 90%. And I have to ask you a question, because you guys hang out here, okay? Now really, this is the center of the responsible elite. Probably right here in this building, right? Probably really. This is why it was created, in memory of the Kennedys and so forth. I didn't have as much admiration for John Kennedy as some people here do, and I thought Bobby was pretty good in his last years, and I love Teddy. And I'm just wondering though, where is accountability? I mean, you break bread with these people? If you have dinner with Lawrence Summers, I mean, you chat away?
I've never had.
Okay, but I mean, there's one, like it's just a game? I mean, is there any fessing up? Is there any, I don't know, I mean, I just find it mind-boggling. And I don't want to be hypocritical here, I also had dinner with some of these people, Mickey Cantor, who supported the so-called welfare reform, he's somebody I know, I guess I consider him a friend. But I've written about it at least publicly, I criticize them publicly now, we can still break bread, okay. But I just don't get the pass, the get out of jail cards.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of the two of us are picking the wrong people to go after, because actually
I'm not going after anything.
Right, yeah.
I'm going after a state.
I was very critical of Summers in a way that many tenured faculty members were not, and I was immensely vulnerable, and unfortunately, I stayed and he left, and I was coming back. We'll see if I stay once he comes back. But I do think that what you're saying is whether or not these people are held accountable by institutions or whether or not they're held accountable by individuals. And I think there are individuals within this institution who stood up against Summers for a whole range of things. Whether or not the institution itself will actually hold people accountable, like Andre Fleischer and what's the Schleifer, whatever. And whether or not institutions will hold people, even Mark Hauser, who's someone who has been accused of an enormous amount of scientific fraud and is on leave right now. We're not sure whether or not he's going to come back. My bet would be probably that he will. And yet we get at the beginning of the term a kind of code of ethics that we're supposed to pass on to our students. And yet institutionally, we're not quite sure the place is living up to the kinds of standards that it purports to embrace. And so it's a question of whether or not the institutions themselves will hold the people that do the worst things accountable. We know that there will always be individuals who will be able to stand up, but those individuals are often the people who are most vulnerable in these institutions, which counteracts or sort of guards against their ability or capacity to do this, because they might get flushed out of the bottom of this before anything happens to begin with.
Well, let me end.
It's not an easy thing to navigate.
I didn't mean to pick on anybody.
Yeah.
And okay, that's not my job anyway. But let me just end by saying, if I made a mistake in this book, there's nothing more frustrating. I'm one of these people, before I got on the red eye last night, I filed my column, okay?
Yeah.
I'm on that plane, JetBlue, wide awake at 5 in the morning, thinking, boy, I screwed it up, that fourth graphic. And there's no internet connection, and how do I change this word, and how can I do blah, blah, and I land the plane, I get on the internet, I check it, I know I got to rush. And I know, I'm sure you guys work, I'm sure everybody here works that same way. So I'm one of these people, and if I don't do it, my friends will tell me where I got it wrong, okay? I operate in an atmosphere where, beginning with my wife, who I dedicated the book to, who was the associate editor of the LA Times and writes her own books and so forth. I'm surrounded with people who will tell me when I get it wrong, okay? Okay, and that's fine, that's how we grow, and I'll change it in the next edition, and before I print the book, I show it to a lot of people who maybe see it differently, or if your question, how would they explain it? Trust me, I showed my manuscript to people who I thought would tear it apart, I have plenty of friends who worked in the Clinton administration. My dean at Annenberg, the guy who gave me my job, was head of Voice of America, and was a friend of Bill. Jeff Cowan, a really great guy, he was here, wasn't he, with a little shell at some kind of position. And, I gave him the book thinking he would hate it, and, he said, no, Bob, somebody had to say it. So I'm open to this. What I don't understand is why these people, how they sail along, okay? How they create an environment in which they're not challenged, or not challenged in a way that is truly disturbing to them. And I think part of it's money and power and prestige. You can give out rewards, you can hire people, you can have aides and PR people and lawyers, and everybody tells you what you want to hear, But even the New York Times, to this day, the New York Times has not really critically evaluated its own role in this. Now, they've got some very good reporters, they've done some very good work, since. But, you know, in the main, I think the disconnect is we don't feel the suffering that we create, okay? You know, I have to tell you, well, that's one last night.
Yeah, I want to close.
Okay, I wrote a lot about Vietnam. I went to Vietnam in the early 60s, you mentioned it. I remember one time writing something, and then I wrote a book. A guy wrote a book, I can't remember the book, but it was, I think it was called Friendly Fire. It was about the death of a young man in Iowa. And it said in the book that his father said, no, he didn't die in a just war. And he gave the report, I think his name was Byron, he gave my thing on Vietnam. I felt terrible. I felt I cheated his father out of, you know, the heroism of his son. I felt awful about it, you know. And I think, you know, having some sense of the connection between your words and your work and what you do and implications for others, you know, should be normal, should be your human nature. I think the question you have the right to ask of people who come out of your most elite, and I use the word elite in a flattering way, the best and the brightest, people who test well, who are really smart, you have the right to ask, you know, where is their soul? You really have the right to ask that question. And how can there be such a disconnect, you know, between, you know, the word games you're playing, the models you're creating, the laws you're passing, and the actual implications for real human beings? And, you know, and to the degree that our main institutions tolerate that disconnect, I think they become centers of immorality.
All right, on that note, thank you all.